Johnny Carson retired in 1992 and disappeared. He turned down guest appearances, refused interviews, and kept cameras out of his home. For 13 years until his death in 2005, he lived in Malibu like a ghost. The public wondered why. Why would the most famous host in television history choose total isolation? The mystery haunted Hollywood for decades, and now we finally know the answer, and it's not what people expected. This is the real story of Johnny Carson, the man nobody actually knew, the childhood that broke him. Johnny Carson grew up in the Midwest with a family that never felt safe or stable. His mother Ruth was distant and critical in ways that left permanent scars. Nothing Johnny did was ever quite good enough for her. She withheld affection like it was currency and made him earn every scrap of approval. She would praise other children in front of him, point out his failures, and question why he could not be more like this kid or that kid. Friends who knew the family said Ruth Carson was cold even by standards of that era. She did not hug or encourage him in any way. When Johnny started getting famous, she would still find ways to criticize him. She'd tell him his suits did not fit right, that his jokes were not as good as other comedians, and that he was getting too big for his britches. That kind of parenting does not just hurt in the moment, it rewires how you see yourself forever. His father Homer drank too much and moved the family around constantly for work through Nebraska, Iowa, and Norfolk. The Carson family never stayed anywhere long enough for Johnny to build real, lasting connections with anyone. He learned early that people were temporary and that home was not a place but a performance you gave to make others comfortable. That kind of childhood leaves marks that never heal. It teaches you two survival skills that become permanent: perform to earn love and hide anything that looks vulnerable, weak, or real. Even as a kid doing magic tricks in Nebraska, Johnny learned that being on stage was safer than being himself. When he made people laugh, they liked him, and when he stopped performing, they forgot about him. That lesson became the foundation of his entire life and career. Be entertaining or be alone. There was no middle ground and no other option. The two Johnny Carsons. When Johnny became famous, he did not suddenly become outgoing or comfortable with people. Colleagues who worked with him for decades consistently described two completely different Johnny Carsons: the quick, playful host who could charm anyone on camera, and the reserved, chilly man you met the second the show ended. Staff writers and band members said you could work with Johnny for years and never get past small talk about weather or golf. He would be brilliant during taping, warm, funny, and present, all while making eye contact, laughing, and engaging with guests and crew. Then the cameras would turn off and he would become someone else entirely. Cold, distant, and unreachable. He would walk off set without saying goodbye, go straight to his dressing room, and lock the door. Ed McMahon sat next to Johnny for 30 years and more than 10,000 shows. Ed admitted publicly he never really knew Carson on a deep personal level. He never had dinner at Johnny's house and never met his family meaningfully. Think about that. Your closest professional partner for 30 years and you never got past the surface. That was not a quirk. That was deliberate policy. Johnny kept strict boundaries because he was deeply uncomfortable with emotional exposure. He did not trust people and could not let them in even when they earned it. Doc Severinsen led the band for 25 years and said the same thing. He never got close. Peter LaSalle produced the show for years and said Johnny was the most private person he ever met. These were not distant associates. These were people who spent decades in close proximity to Johnny Carson, and all of them described working with a ghost, someone who was there but not really there. His marriages followed a destructive pattern. Johnny Carson married 4 times over the course of his life: Jody Wolcott in 1949, Joanne Copeland in 1963, Joanna Holland in 1972, and Alexis Moss in 1987. 4 different women, but the same cycle every single time. There'd be intense attraction at the start when everything was new, surface level, and exciting. Then distance as the relationship required more. Then conflict when she wanted intimacy he could not provide. Then divorce. His first marriage to Jody lasted 14 years, but was troubled almost from the beginning. She said he was never really present, even when they were in the same room, and that he treated their home like a hotel he occasionally visited between shows. They had 3 sons together: Christopher, Corey, and Richard. But Johnny struggled with fatherhood. He did not know how to connect with his own children and repeated the same distant parenting he had experienced. His second marriage to Joanne lasted 10 years. She later said Johnny was charming at first, but impossible to live with long term. She'd say that he would shut down emotionally without warning and go days without really speaking. His third marriage to Joanna lasted 10 years and was by far the most public and expensive. The divorce settlement cost him millions. Joanna gave brutal interviews afterward describing life with Johnny as living with a stranger who occasionally visited. She said he was there physically but gone emotionally. present at dinner, but thinking about work or anything other than her. Friends who knew him through all these marriages said he was most comfortable in the beginning when relationships were new and everything was exciting and surface level. But the moment a relationship required real emotional vulnerability, he would start pulling away, creating distance, finding reasons to retreat into work or hobbies, and building walls. That pattern destroyed every marriage except the last one to Alexis Moss. She was different. She understood that Johnny needed space and control. She did not push for intimacy he could not give and let him set the terms completely. That worked. They stayed married until he died in 2005. But even then, people close to them said it was less a traditional partnership and more a carefully managed arrangement where both people knew the boundaries and never crossed them. Alexis gave Johnny what he needed most: distance without loneliness and companionship without demands. On The Tonight Show, Johnny compensated for his emotional discomfort with total, absolute control over every aspect of production. He demanded a tight professional operation that ran like clockwork with writers on schedule, guests prepared and briefed, and staff following unspoken rules about how close they could get. Nobody dropped by his dressing room without explicit permission. Nobody asked personal questions about his life or family. Nobody pushed boundaries or tried to be friendly beyond basic professionalism. That control made the show look effortless and spontaneous. It also meant that when the cameras turned off, Johnny could withdraw into a carefully constructed world where he decided who got access and on what terms. Former staff members described The Tonight Show as a well-oiled machine that ran on fear of disappointing Johnny. Not because he yelled or threw tantrums. He almost never yelled. That was not his style. But because his disapproval was so quiet and cold that it felt worse than any anger. If you crossed a line or broke protocol, he would just shut you out completely. He'd stop talking to you, stop making eye contact, and look through you like you did not exist. That silent treatment was more terrifying than any tantrum or confrontation. People learned incredibly quickly. You stay professional, do your job, do not get close, do not ask questions, and do not try to connect. That was how you survived around Johnny Carson. There were specific incidents that became legendary among staff. A writer who asked about Johnny's weekend plans got frozen out for weeks. A production assistant who made the mistake of knocking on his dressing room door unannounced never got spoken to directly again. Johnny would give instructions through other people. That level of control extended to every aspect of his work environment: the temperature in the studio, the lighting, the exact placement of his desk, the timing of commercial breaks, the types of guests who were booked, and the questions that were off limits. Everything was managed down to the smallest detail because control was the only thing that made Johnny feel safe. By the late 1980s, Johnny had endured several personal blows that hardened his suspicion of the world and confirmed his worst beliefs about people. His second divorce to Joanne in 1972 was brutal and expensive. His third divorce to Joanna in 1983 was even worse and cost him tens of millions in the settlement. Tabloids ran endless stories about his personal life during both divorces, covering his finances, his relationships, and his failures as a husband. Details that should have been private became public entertainment. He hated it and absolutely despised the intrusion, the feeling that strangers thought they had a right to know about his pain. Then came the Joan Rivers split in 1986, which was perhaps the deepest cut of all. Joan had been a regular guest on The Tonight Show for years. More than that, she had been Johnny's permanent guest host when he took vacations. He had helped make her career by putting her on his show over and over when she was still unknown and making her famous. She called him a friend and said she loved him like family. Then, in 1986, Fox offered her a competing late-night show. She accepted without telling Johnny first and just announced it publicly at a press conference. Johnny found out from the news like everyone else. He felt betrayed on a level that was almost unimaginable, humiliated, and used. He never spoke to Joan Rivers again, not once. For the remaining 19 years of his life, he refused to even hear her name. Staff knew not to mention her, and guests knew not to bring her up. Joan tried multiple times to apologize. She sent letters and tried to reach out through mutual friends. Johnny refused every attempt and burned the letters unopened. That incident confirmed what Johnny had always suspected deep down. People would use you, betray you, and turn your trust into ammunition the moment it benefited them. The machine that made him a legend could turn private pain into public content at any moment. Fame was not a gift. It was a trap, and the only way to survive was to give nothing real to anyone ever. After the Joan Rivers split, Johnny became even more guarded and even more suspicious. The walls got higher, the circle got smaller, trust became impossible. Even at the height of his fame, Johnny kept his social circle incredibly small and carefully controlled. He was most comfortable with a handful of people, tennis partners he had known for years, card buddies who understood the rules, and a few neighbors in Malibu who respected his privacy. But even those friendships operated on his terms. He liked predictable routines that he could control, weekly card games at his house where everyone knew not to ask personal questions, tennis matches that had nothing to do with conversation, sailing alone or with one quiet companion, reading for hours in his study, and quiet dinners at the same restaurants where staff knew to seat him away from other diners. Anything that felt chaotic or demanded emotional openness made him pull back immediately. Friends learned that if they pushed for real connection, Johnny would simply stop calling, stop inviting them over, and let the friendship fade without explanation. That was how he managed relationships his entire adult life. He would decide how close someone could get, and the moment they tried to get closer, he would create distance. It was not personal, it was survival. The only way he knew how to protect himself from being hurt again. Retirement in May 1992 gave Johnny the chance to live exactly the way he had always wanted deep down, entirely on his own terms with no obligations to anyone. He turned down every single guest appearance request, and there were many. David Letterman asked him to come on The Late Show multiple times over the years. Jay Leno asked repeatedly, including Conan O'Brien years later. Every major talk show host wanted Johnny Carson for at least one appearance. Johnny said no to all of them, every single one. He refused almost every interview request from journalists and documentarians. People offered huge amounts of money just for a simple conversation. He said no and kept cameras completely out of his Malibu home. He rarely appeared in public. When he did go out, it was to the same few places at the same times where he knew he would not be bothered. For the public watching from the outside, it looked mysterious, strange, and almost disturbing. Why would someone who seemed to love performing suddenly want nothing to do with it? Why would the most famous host in television history choose total isolation? But for Johnny, it was completely logical and made perfect sense. He had spent 30 years being seen and analyzed by millions of people every single night while performing, being vulnerable in controlled doses, and managing his image. He had absolutely no interest in being watched as an aging retired host instead of the sharp, controlled figure people remembered from the show. He understood how television worked better than anyone. He knew how quickly the narrative could shift from legendary host to sad old man trying to stay relevant, and how cruel audiences could be to people who stayed too long. He would not allow that to happen. He would not give anyone the chance to see him diminished. So he chose total withdrawal instead, and disappeared so completely that most people forgot he was still alive. But here's the detail that explains Johnny Carson better than anything else anyone could say about him. He never stopped caring about the craft of comedy and never stopped thinking like a writer. After retirement, he would still sit in his Malibu home and write jokes. Good ones, sharp ones, the kind of monologue material that would have killed on The Tonight Show. And he would fax them to David Letterman's show. Anonymously at first, just pages of jokes with no name, no return address, and nothing to identify who sent them. Then Letterman and his writers figured out who was sending them and recognized the style, the timing, and the voice. Johnny kept doing it for years anyway, writing, refining, and faxing jokes to Burbank. Then he'd watch The Late Show to see if they used his material and to see if his lines still landed with an audience. That single detail captures Johnny Carson more perfectly than any biography or interview ever could. He still wanted to create, still needed to be funny, and still wanted his lines to work in front of a live audience and get laughs. But he wanted absolutely none of the obligations or exposure that came with being the face on screen. He kept the creative satisfaction and discarded everything else, the fame, the attention, and the vulnerability of being seen. He controlled exactly how much of himself he gave, and to whom and when. That was Johnny Carson at his core. Never fully gone, but never fully present either. Always performing, but always hidden. Giving enough to be remembered, but never enough to be truly known. Underneath all of it was a simple, harsh belief that shaped every decision Johnny made during his final 13 years. Life after the spotlight would always look smaller and sadder on television than it felt in private. Johnny did not want viewers to see him diminished in any way, bored, old, slower, frail, or struggling to be relevant or funny or sharp. He had watched other legends fade over the years and seen how the entertainment industry treated aging stars, how audiences turned on people who stayed too long or came back when they should not have, and how cruel the commentary could be. He had seen what happened to Milton Berle when he tried comebacks, to Bob Hope as he got older, and his timing slipped, and to other hosts who did not know when to quit. The press and public that once loved them would turn vicious, mock them, and use them as examples of people who could not let go. Johnny understood that dynamic better than almost anyone. He would rather disappear completely and be remembered as a legend than risk even one appearance that invited unfavorable comparison. So he engineered one final, carefully controlled illusion and curated the very last image anyone would ever have of him. Johnny Carson, as people remembered him sitting at that desk in May 1992, sharp, in control, funny, and at the absolute height of his powers. And then, nothing afterward. No comeback attempts, no reunion specials, no Barbara Walters interviews, no slow public decline for people to witness and discuss and analyze, just silence and distance. That was the only way to preserve what he had built over 30 years and to protect the legend from the messy, uncomfortable reality of being human and aging and eventually dying. He chose myth over humanity, image over truth, and control over connection. The mystery of Johnny Carson was never really about where he went after retirement. It was about who he actually was underneath 30 years of performance. And the answer is darker and sadder than most people wanted to believe or accept. He was a man so damaged by his childhood that he never learned how to connect with other people in any real, meaningful way. He was a performer who understood that being liked and being known were two completely different things. He was someone who spent 30 years making millions of Americans feel like they knew him intimately while carefully ensuring that nobody actually did. Not his co-workers, not his wives, not his children, not his closest professional partners. Nobody ever got past the performance to find the real person underneath. His retirement was not mysterious when you understand this. It was inevitable. He had been hiding his whole life from everyone, including himself. Retirement just let him do it more completely and more permanently. No more performance 5 nights a week. No more pretending to be warm and accessible. No more managing his image for public consumption. Just the complicated, wounded, intensely guarded man who had been there all along, finally completely alone the way some part of him had always wanted to be. The tragedy of Johnny Carson is not that he retired and disappeared. The tragedy is that Johnny Carson became the single most beloved host in television history by being someone he was not. And the moment he stopped performing, he had almost nothing left. No deep relationships, no real connections with family, no close friends who actually knew him, just money and control and an ocean view and silence. He spent his last 13 years in that Malibu house watching the Pacific, playing cards with the same small, carefully chosen group of people who understood not to ask personal questions, reading, sailing alone, and living quietly in routines that never changed. He got sick with emphysema in his final years as the decades of heavy smoking caught up with him. He died on January 23, 2005, and most of America did not even know he had been sick or dying. That was exactly what Johnny wanted, to slip away without anyone watching or analyzing or turning his death into a spectacle. No cameras, no deathbed interviews, no final performance, just gone. Disappeared as completely in death as he had tried to in life. So here's the question nobody wants to answer. Was Johnny Carson happy? Did the control and isolation he fought for actually give him peace? Or did he spend those final years realizing that the walls he built to protect himself had become a prison? We will never know. Johnny made sure of that. He left no journals, no confessions, and no explanation. Just the image he wanted people to remember, and the silence that followed. What do you think? Was Johnny Carson protecting himself or destroying himself? Did the isolation save him or trap him? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden lives of television legends, make sure you click subscribe to support the channel.